To many, stopping the spread of disinformation is a fight for the truth.
Facebook promoted violence against Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar back in 2016.
Has added confusion and panic.
But to others, it's simply a tool to control what we think and what we believe.
Governments and legacy media
pressuring Facebook to delete posts that conflicted with its...
Who gets to decide what is and isn't real, what is and isn't a lie, and how that information is disseminated?
False news has become all too common on social media.
My name is Mohamed Hassan, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.
Are there people who dissented from the consensus on vaccines who you regard as credible?
I have never heard of one, but I'm not an expert in vaccines. Are you?
So I don't think labeling is censorship, and we might disagree on that.
And so who does this labeling? And I just think human nature makes that more dangerous than the speech itself.
Our debate today: who has the power to define the truth? Joining me today is Associate Professor Renee DiResta, who studies the ways people try to manipulate, harass, or target others online. She's the author of a book called Invisible Rulers: The People Who Turn Lies into Reality. I also want to welcome Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald, who is a co-founder of The Intercept and now hosts a show called System Update. And we're joined by Professor Siva Vaidhyanathan, who directs the Center of Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Thank you all for being here, and a warm welcome.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Renee, if I can start with you. When we talk about disinformation, how do you define it?
So I think of it as a subset of propaganda. I think of it, so I'll start by talking maybe about propaganda, which is information with an agenda, where somebody is trying to shape a belief or activate an audience to do something. And propaganda can be very overt, right? When we see maybe a message from state media, we know what the motivation behind the message is. But disinformation usually refers to the kind of messaging where that attribution is obscured. So perhaps it's coming from an outlet that is actively misattributed. It is made to look like something else. For example, a outlet created by a foreign government but made to look like a media outlet. So either the outlet itself is front media, it's fake, it's not authentic, or the behaviors, if it's moving content across social media, are inauthentic, meaning they're using bots or they're trying to manipulate an algorithm, trying to get amplification in a way that is not organic. Sometimes the content is false or misleading, though that's really debatable because oftentimes in propaganda, there is nothing falsifiable about the claim. It's just trying to prey on emotions, trying to make somebody feel a certain way or act a certain way. So when we're talking about disinformation, I think what's most important to understand is that it's intentional. It's part of a very coordinated campaign where a powerful person or entity wants another group of people to think a certain way, to act a certain way, to believe a certain thing. And so they are using the means at their disposal, the media means at their disposal to achieve that end.
Siva, that question of what is and isn't propaganda is always up for debate, right?
Look, the Bible's propaganda, right? And in fact, the word propaganda comes from the notion of spreading the Gospels, right? Propagating the Gospels. So anytime you're trying to get people to buy into a belief or take an action, you're engaging in propaganda. So it's not necessarily derogatory, right, to call something propaganda. It's simply a matter of fact. And now if I were engaging in disinformation, I would have not just an agenda, because all propaganda has an agenda. I would have some intention to mislead you, intention to distract you, intention to confuse you. One of those goals, or all of them, right, to sort of mess with the process, not only of individual thought, but of group deliberation.
Sometimes I do think we create new terms for things that aren't new at all. I would certainly say that of propaganda, and you yourself said propaganda has been around for as long as the written word has, for as long as people have been communicating. I think the same is true of disinformation. I don't know why we needed a new term for claims that are untrue, claims that are false, people who are intentionally deceiving. This is not a new phenomenon at all. Well before there was the pervasiveness of the internet, We had leading institutions, media institutions working hand in hand with the government to propagate lies. That's what led to the Vietnam War, lies about the Gulf of Tonkin and what happened there. We obviously had the same thing with the New York Times selling a narrative about Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program that didn't exist, or his alliance with Osama bin Laden that was propagated in the New York Times, the New Yorker, that also didn't exist. Those were false claims for an agenda. And I think, at least since the Enlightenment, the idea has always been, we know institutions of power are going to deceive. And so when terms start to get invented for things that have long existed, I think it's important to question why. How are those terms being utilized to serve an agenda, which all human beings have? And I think that's where the problem starts to arise.
Do you feel like we are living in a time where the issue of disinformation and misinformation is particularly heightened?
I don't. If anything, I could make an argument that because of the advent of the internet, there's a lot more pluralism now in terms of who gets to speak, who gets to question, who gets to challenge. Even when I look at my own childhood, I remember very well there were 3 television networks, all pretty much owned by corporations that had exactly the same kind of agenda. Same with large newspapers. So there's a very homogenized discourse that was dominant. Now with the advent of the internet, you don't have to have a big TV studio to reach a lot of people. You don't have to have a printing press to release a lot of people. And so there's a much greater diversity of views. Obviously, with a diversity of views, there's going to be some toxic or harmful or untrue claims being made. But that was certainly true when there was a greater concentration of control over the discourse as well back in the 1900s, the 1950s, and the Cold War, the War on Terror. All of those things also had a lot of capacity to issue propaganda and deceit, but with far less challenge.
I wonder what you have to say about that, Siva.
I'm happy to
Yeah.
assert that nothing Glenn just said is disinformation. In fact, nothing Glenn just said is untrue.
It's good. We agree.
and it's actually very helpful. So, but with a couple of responses to put things in context. So, I mean, the concept of disinformation is now in the public circulation, right? It's something that it's a term that we've been throwing around at a pretty prolific level for 6 or 7 years now. Maybe.
Does it mean something
maybe a bit
different than lying?
It does. It does for the reasons Renee pointed out. It's part of an organized campaign to achieve something versus just saying something off the cuff or making up something for the purpose of getting away with something, right? I can lie about chopping down a cherry tree, and that's just a lie. It's not necessarily disinformation. Disinformation is part of a campaign to achieve some larger end, usually. And I think that's what we started seeing, around 2015, 16 in this country. We started seeing a lot of homegrown groups echoing messages that were also being propagated by Russia. It doesn't mean they came from Russia. It doesn't mean that Russia was like controlling anything or pulling strings, but it does mean there was echoes and coherence. So what of that is merely some weird people saying weird stuff like Texas should secede, and what of that is the Russian effort to confuse and seed dissension and seed disaffection in the United States? It's impossible to pull those things apart. Nonetheless, I think it's up to us to try to figure out how much of that mattered, and if it did matter, what can we do to address it? And as you pointed out, like the proliferation of channels through the internet has allowed all of that. The unexpected consequence of that, or maybe underestimated consequence of that, has been cacophony. When you have cacophony, it's very hard to think collectively, as hard as it is to think individually, right?
I do think sometimes when people select their examples of disinformation, oftentimes that kind of reveals an agenda as well. Like I think people in the United States who believe that the Russians interfered in our discourse and our elections sometimes, speak about that first and overlook ways that there's other kinds of disinformation, including from the U.S. government. You kind of alluded to that during the Cold War. I think it's a lot of that is still taking place now. But just to give a really hardcore example that I think has generated a lot of the distrust and the idea that we can trust institutions to determine truth and falsity was what happened in COVID. And we may not have to agree on all the facts, but one of the things that did happen is that extremely early on in the pandemic, before much was known about the virus, there was a lot of internal debate within the community of epidemiologists at the highest levels about whether it came from a lab and was manipulated by humans or whether it crossed over from animal to humans and was zoonotic in origin.
Yep.
There's a lot of different expert opinions, and then this article gets published on the proximal origins of COVID, and it declares definitively that we know for certain, we're pretty close to certain, that this did not come from a lab, and that any suggestion that it was manipulated by humans or that it came from a lab is disinformation or racism against our Chinese colleagues, those sorts of things. And from there, that decree ended up dictating what couldn't be said online. And it started giving people the sense that when we start calling things disinformation, the agenda behind it is to suppress any questioning of it. And I think that's where the concept of disinformation raises the hackles of a lot of people. I think the COVID example is a really good example because there's still, the origins of COVID are not definitively proven.
Yeah.
People still disagree with them, but major scientific community, parts of the scientific community, intelligence agencies from around the West says it's far more likely than not now that it did leak from a lab, not deliberately, but unintentionally. And yet for a year, we were banned from saying that on the internet because of a decree that was disinformation. I think that's where the concern comes from, is the weight that gets put behind the decree.
Sure. So let me take that on, because I think maybe it'll surprise you to hear that I thought that the lab leak policy was ridiculous. The reason that I thought the lab leak policy was a poorly constructed policy was because I didn't think that it could be tied to any kind of material harm. And I thought that it really was an outlier compared to some of the other policies that they chose to implement around COVID, which at least sought to connect a rumor or a false claim to some sort of personal harm. For example, drinking bleach, or, not taking a vaccine, all of the various other ones. Whatever you think about the specific claims, they at least were trying to impact either a personal medical decision or a community medical decision. The lab leak one was significantly an outlier on that front. But what actually happened there, you can go back and you can look at Meta's change logs for its policies. They are actually quite transparent about them. Meta implemented the policy to moderate, to ban, whatever you want to call it, to take down content related to the lab leak in February of 2021. And it says in its disclosure that it did it in consultation with the World Health Organization. And it says that it did it in response to a spate of violence related to, this was around the time where people were concerned about violence related to Asian Americans. This is the justification that happens around this time. In May of 2021, they walked the policy back. And that's because in May of 2021, the new information comes out within the U.S. intelligence communities. They begin to release these statements saying, this is where that kind of the daylight between them, as different agencies say, we think it's natural origin, we don't think it's natural origin. And what you see Meta do there is they walk the policy back. During that,
once the government said, we're not even sure.
Right, when the government says we're not even sure,
100%.
100%. What you're seeing there, I think, and what happens so often in private company moderation efforts, is they make the best decision that they have with the information available to them at the time. And they do it, yes, in consultation with various bodies that they consider to be experts, like the World Health Organization, in consultation with various governments, in consultation with various academic institutions, in consultation with various community groups, depending on what the specific policy is. And you do see them walk through and try to shift their policies in accordance with changing affairs on the ground.
It's like banning a certain view from being, like in the case of Meta.
I'm not arguing it with you.
No, I know. I'm just saying,
I
just want to be clear about what's happening, which is that, and in the case of, Meta and Facebook, in fact, all the social media platforms, the U.S. government, I'm sure they were talking to other organizations as well, including the WHO. I know they were, but the U.S. government was putting a lot of pressure on these companies to the point of badgering, sometimes even threatening them to take down people who were spreading what the government considered to be disinformation, or posts that the government regarded as disinformation about the origins, about masks, about vaccines.
Absolutely see
and
government
that's
officials.
a censorship regime.
You see government officials all over the world jawboning and prevailing upon platforms to take down content at all times. This happens from governments all over the world. I think the best thing that we can ask for in those circumstances is transparency. I think that we should be asking for transparent disclosures when governments do it, because they all do it.
Right. But let's also consider that because these are private companies, doing what is in the best interest of them, of their position in the world, their financial prospects, their ways of satisfying their audiences, and so forth. And they are concerned about any harm they may be potentially contributing to. And especially at that moment, when there was so much confusion and so much concern, and we didn't know that 10 million people would die around the world, but that happened. That they're going to make mistakes. First of all, secondly, is it censorship when a private company exercises its free speech rights to decide what should flow and what should not? If a government forces a country to do that, that is definitely censorship. But that's not what happened with the US government in COVID at all. It's not what happened with the US government in any case dealing with any of these platforms. And that's largely because the US government is rare, if not unique, about having an absolute prohibition against that in its constitution. But if a private company decides we want less of this or we want none of this, that's free speech. Right? That's a company exercising its, from the US perspective, First Amendment rights. And I think we all agree that companies should be allowed to exercise their First Amendment rights as they judge. Doesn't mean they're not going to make mistakes. Doesn't mean we're not going to argue with them. The fascinating thing about COVID is because, as you pointed out, like, it was so confusing. It was so scary. We had so much both new information and bad information coming out of a scientific community that was flailing with something it had never dealt with before. At the moment when it became really clear what the nature of this virus was, how it spread, how which segments of a population it is most going to harm, at the moment we actually achieved some sort of decent knowledge of what we were facing. We also faced this swarm of there's no other word for it, misinformation, not necessarily disinformation, right? That wasn't coming from an interested party, but was just coming from a general sense of fear and frustration and being expressed in various different ways. And we see the anti-vaccine movement flow from that, right? I think what it reflected, the fact that all of a sudden, all of these people eschewed this completely safe, completely helpful new vaccine out of fear, speaks to the fact that we were all confused and we were all scared and we were all unwilling to trust authority. That is a much bigger problem, because the next time we have a pandemic, or the next time we have a climate crisis, or the next time we have a human migration crisis, are we going to be able to have the kind of deep, informed deliberation in a country or in the world that allows us to address the problem in a successful way and minimize the number of people harmed along the way? And I'm not confident we can do that, because I do think we've created a cultural ecosystem and a media ecosystem that allows for the amplification of the strongest statements, the most passionate statements, and dispassionate statements get washed to the side. They get washed into the eddies, and they don't end up leading our discussions and our decisions.
You are right to be concerned that if there's a next pandemic or a next wartime event or something, people are going to be cynical or skeptical or suspicious of attempts by institutions to make claims that are or issue policies that are binding. I think it's very important to ask why that is, though.
Oh, yeah.
These institutions that we're supposed to respect, that are supposed to have credibility, have been caught lying repeatedly, going back, again, to the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the Iraq War. There's a lot of different things that have eroded people's faith and trust in these institutions. And I think it's very important for people who want to kind of encourage trust in those institutions to ask why that faith has been lost. For the FBI or the White House to call private companies and say, what is this doing here? We told you to take this down. I mean, the government's power is immense.
What I said before,
it's also not omnipotence, right?
You can look at Facebook. We talked about it before. You were the one who said it. Like, Facebook banned any questioning of the zoonotic origin, while the U.S. government's position was it's already proven to be zoonotic. Once the U.S. government said, okay, no, you know what? Now we agree it can be debated. Facebook then said, okay, now you can debate it. They followed the government's lead.
Exactly. As they decided
which is extremely alarming. That's a government-led censorship scheme.
And clearly, they were working with the best information they had at the moment to try to minimize harms. As Renee said, that was a bad call. And I think everybody now agrees that that was an overstatement.
What was a bad call?
The notion that there was
terrible.
that limiting the discussion and of that position and that debate had some harm in society, which it really didn't. Like, whether the virus came from a lab or the virus came from a wet market was not going to have a difference in people's lives.
What about the debate over whether vaccine mandates are
that's
justified?
a policy decision. Absolutely.
No, but should that be freely debated too?
Of course.
And what about whether the vaccine is safe and effective?
that's not really a debate because that's a factual question.
No, people have a lot of
Yeah,
disagreements
but
about whether
they're wrong if they say it's not
okay,
safe and not
but no,
effective.
I'm asking you, should they be banned from
No, of
from
course it should be
questioning them?
banned, but it's not a
But
debate.
that's what happened.
But to call it a debate implies that there are actually two sides that have some evidence and some reason to be engaged. That's just nonsense. And we should have the ability, and this is why science is so important, to filter through sense from nonsense and
But
focus
are
our
there
energies.
scientists though who think that the vaccine was either unnecessary or dangerous?
No
Were there
scientists who know what they're
credentialed
doing.
Scientists?
No.
There aren't.
So that brings up an interesting.
Absolutely not.
There were no credentialed scientists who questioned
There
the
are
efficacy or
credentialed
safety of
scientists
the
who are
vaccine. They testified in
meteorologists.
Congress.
Maybe meteorologists,
No,
but nobody
real
who's an
scientists.
actual respected vaccine person. Absolutely not.
Jay Bhattacharya was an epidemiologist and scientist.
He has no credentials anymore
Well,
because he has been completely out
Is
of
he
the
not a
loop.
scientist?
Of course he is, but that doesn't mean he has any respect in the community. The community has completely pushed him aside. What we saw in the pandemic was fascinating because you saw a very condensed set of paradigm shifts about what a virus can do, what a coronavirus specifically can do, a completely new set of understandings about what it can do. And in that process, in those like 8 to 10 months of trying to figure this out, not to mention trying to figure out what its genetic makeup was to create an mRNA vaccine, in that process, we actually saw multiple paradigm shifts within the epidemiological community, within the virology community, because people were willing to run a test on a hypothesis, find incomplete results, make mistakes, find out that the previous paper was wrong, all in a really short period of time. It was actually a kind of a beautiful example of science working, but the problem was because science has to communicate with a public that is looking for answers, is looking for a way not to have someone get sick, looking for a way to be able to continue a job or continue going to school, all of which are deeply important. There was such tension, such confusion, such frustration. And the messages coming out of the scientific community seemed, as they were, to change every week or 2 weeks or month. And therefore, the instructions and ultimately mandates coming from governments changed, it seemed, every month or every few months. And they were different in Texas than they were in Pennsylvania, right? So that just created, in our media ecosystem that is cacophonous, an inability to actually have the kind of faith and trust in an institution that we need in a moment of that emergency. And while, yes, the US government in its various forms and offices has lied to us time and time again, the Centers for Disease Control has never had anything but the public interest in mind. And even though, again, now we actually know how to deal with this. We know that everybody should get vaccinated. We know that masks work sometimes in some ways and somewhat effectively. They may not work in all cases in other ways. They're not magical.
Who's we when you say we know this?
The public now knows it because the scientific community has come to a solid consensus for which there really isn't reasonable dissension.
Are there people who dissented from the consensus on vaccines who you regard as credible?
I have never heard of one, but I'm not an expert in vaccines. Are you?
No, but that's why I'd like there to be a free and open debate. And I
But there
understand that
is.
sometimes people who dissent
there
from consensus
is.
prove to be right in history.
Absolutely, which is what was happening in all these ways that are not big flashpoints.
No, the public debate was censored. That was the problem.
But the public debate was, okay, the public debate, we could argue whether the public debate was censored. The public debate was not censored because all the time that you and I were watching it, we were hearing anti-vaccine people pour their stuff out. They weren't scientists because you couldn't find reasonable scientists who were arguing against the vaccine. You could only find kooks who were arguing against the vaccine. There were lots of people arguing about masks in various legislatures and various school boards and various county governments. You were hearing people talk about masks in the public, on social media. All of that was out there. There was no lack of argument. I wouldn't call it debate, but there was no lack of response.
That raises an interesting point about what role, if any, the government needs to have in these kinds of public debates when it comes to issues like public safety, public health. Renee, what do you think?
Sure. Perfect. I want to we're not in complete agreement. I think one of the things that I wanted to see during COVID, and one of the things that I did during COVID as an academic was studied viral rumors. And I use the word rumors on purpose because rumors sometimes turn out to be true. They usually go viral because people are very concerned about them. And sometimes they turn out to be true. And often they turn out to be false. But people share them because they're genuinely concerned. And one of the things that I was intrigued by and remain intrigued by is how badly institutions communicate in those moments. And one of the reasons for that is that they don't have very large audiences, they don't have the reach, and they don't participate in the conversation in that way. And so what we saw happening over and over again during COVID was the CDC and others put out press releases, they give press conferences, they give quotes to top-down media, right? But they are not engaging with the public in the public sphere where the public is forming its opinions in that real-time discourse where as the rumor is going viral, they want the answer now. And part of that is because science does take time and they don't feel that they can participate in that way because they believe that they have to maintain a certain degree of credibility, which requires them to have an accurate answer before they speak. Rather than what I think they could do is say, this is what we know now. This is our best guess in this moment. And instead of doing that, what we saw them do time and time again was lead from behind, where consensus had formed among influential, loud voices on the internet, the new elite, if you will, the people who are incredibly loud and impactful and have significant reach. And as a function of that reach and that constant back and forth with their audience, have accrued a degree of trust that is wholly, I would say, divorced from actual expertise. They are not medical professionals. They are not running experiments. They are not doing that work, but they have a lot of trust. So the institutions are not participating in the discourse in the way that we would want them to. And that, I think, is a very significant problem. So one of the things that I argued for at the time was that social media companies needed to do maybe a better job surfacing the voices of authoritative experts that were not institutional. So, for example, during COVID in the early days of 2020, that might be the frontline emergency room doctors, particularly here in New York, who could say, this is what we are seeing in the emergency rooms. Even just to push back against you remember the narrative like COVID's not real. It's real. People are dying. I'm a doctor. Let me tell you about it. How do you surface that kind of credible voice? Because one of the problems when we talk about more speech, when you have an information environment in which speech is curated for you, and in which the information that you see is determined by an algorithm, and we are not all seeing the same thing, the question of what should be weighted and how that feed should be ranked it becomes critically important. And if we don't want it to default to approved institutional voices, then we have to have some other notion of what it means to get information to the public in a crisis. One of the things that I think we should be asking now is what are ways in which we can use community signal to amplify that a little bit better? Right now, it's a very binary thing. It's engagement. That's all we have. Twitter was actually actively trying to blue check those emergency room doctors. But the problem that they had was that those emergency room doctors are not regularly on Twitter. They have no reach. I think we have to recognize that there has to be some system of like, here we are declaring transparently that we are doing this. Like we as a, the tech platform as a company is saying, this is what we have decided to do and here is why. Similarly, when there's a request that comes in to take something down or throttle it, this is what we have chosen to do and why. There is no neutral in this information environment. And so I think the best hope that we have for laying out who is participating and how is the platform saying, on our platform, this is what we have chosen to do. And here is our disclosure of what we are doing.
We're so far from having a decent system, a political and media system on both sides that allows for the right kind of dissent that comes from a position of knowledge, expertise, a commitment to the public good. And I don't have a simple answer to it. We do have a problem with the concentration and power of at least two major companies, Meta and Alphabet, having way too much control over what flows around. So what do we do about that? Well, we should probably have more platforms with different perspectives and different practices.
Well, the government's trying to break them up right now to do exactly that.
And well,
the
led by
Biden
Europe.
and the Trump administration.
Absolutely. Led by Europe.
There's other ways to do it, just to be clear. You're on Rumble, right? There's a whole bunch of different platforms. I'm on Blue Sky. What I love about Blue Sky, just to be, just to plug here, is that it's a protocol-based platform, which means different people can run different instances. And the other thing that's amazing about it is that you can choose different feeds, which to this question of filtering means that you can see a whole lot of different viewpoints and you can subscribe quite deliberately ability to see a whole bunch of different
But you can do the
viewpoints.
opposite too, right? You can purposely see only the
You
things that
can,
are
yes,
aligned with
absolutely,
your
100%.
views.
That is this is where I think this question, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, is how do you create a desire for pluralistic opinions, right? How do you make people want to see that? How do you diffuse the entrenchment and make it feel like a thing that people want to experience?
Are there
created for
conservatives
them?
in your Blue Sky feed?
Yes. Well, to the extent that there are conservatives on Blue Sky.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
So-
like Trump supporter types.
I actually follow them on Twitter still.
Right,
Like, I read them
exactly.
on X.
Exactly.
But this is where we've moved into a decentralization where people are just on different platforms, and that's how the diaspora has gone.
With the exception
right?
of Facebook, which still has 3 billion users.
Right.
It's still
Plus
the big,
Instagram.
Yeah, exactly. So when you consider that, they're not even at peak growth. They only have about a third of the population of India using their platform. So India still has tremendous potential for Meta growth, and they're totally in bed with the government there, right? Meta and the Modi government work together on just about everything. And I guarantee you, when Mark Zuckerberg wakes up in the morning, he thinks much more about India than he does the United States, because that is where the future is. That's where his money and his power is going to come from in the future. And that is something that we really should be concerned about. That level of concentration of power, whether it's used benevolently or malevolently, is going to be something that we need to worry about more and more as they grow. In the United States, they peaked in terms of their market penetration years ago. So we don't think about new people joining Facebook, but still something like 75% of Americans have Facebook accounts. So that, even though there's no growth, there is tremendous influence, and it's going to get to be a bigger influence in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, and in South Asia. And again, that's before Meta ever gets into China, if it ever does. There's all this stuff that we should be worrying about with the concentration of power of Meta. And what can we do about it? Well, both in Europe, where there are a number of efforts to not necessarily break up Facebook, but curb its influence and curb the influence of Google/Alphabet, but also in the United States with its efforts to look at antitrust intervention with these companies. We're seeing that conversation start. I don't think there's a realistic potential of breaking up that company or undoing the acquisitions that it had before. So within all of that, though, we have to figure out ways to limit the power of that company. I don't think there's any other company that really should be worrying us, except with the possibility of Google. But I don't think that we've addressed that problem.
But that goes
concentration
back
problem.
before to what we were talking about. I'm sorry,
Mhm.
just to quickly say, before when we were talking about what Facebook did during the pandemic,
Right.
which is censor questioning the origin theory, you were saying, "Oh, it's just a private company; they have the right to do that," and that's what
Yeah.
the point I was trying
Well, I
to
didn't
make
use
was
just. I
for-
just.
no, you're right. No, it's a
Yeah,
private
yeah,
company.
it is a
They
private
have the
company.
right to
They
do
do.
that.
Yeah.
But be that they don't necessarily have that right if they're a monopoly, right? Like
Yeah,
you're not really a private company if you're ruled to be a monopoly, and we're going to see whether or not courts are willing to rule them that way. I think they clearly are, and that's all the more reason why I'm concerned when big tech companies, either influenced by the government, like you were saying before, they follow their bottom line. If I were a Facebook executive, if I were a Google executive, I'd want to keep the U.S. government happy. That's the best for my bottom line. So I'd listen to what they want me to take down. Sure. I think that is happening. But also, even if they are making the decisions on their own, when they banned Trump, there were a lot of leaders in the Democratic world, Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron and AMLO in Mexico, people who have no love for Trump at all, who said, this is extremely disturbing, not because they don't think Trump should be banned, but because they thought, how can it be that private monopolies, huge, massive corporations, have more power than governments to decide what can and can't be heard? And that's why I particularly worry about big tech censorship, because it's not just it's not like a bookstore deciding, I don't want to have this book. Absolutely. And then you go down the street and get it at the next bookstore. The reality is that's where our debates happen. That's where our information is dispersed, and allowing them to block or censor or suppress viewpoints, I think, is extremely dangerous. It's almost as potent, if not more potent, than the government.
You have to allow them to do that if you believe in the First Amendment, because they have the power.
Not if
under
they're
the First Amendment.
monopolies.
Yeah, they're not exempt from the First Amendment by being a monopoly.
No, but monopoly. I mean, once AT&T is a monopoly, or a railroad is a monopoly,
Right.
or Standard Oil is a monopoly, they don't have all the same rights as
They do
private
have First
companies. They're
Amendment
not really
rights.
considered to be.
They have First Amendment rights, whether or not they have, and they do have all the basic rights. They just were broken up. Their shareholders didn't have the right to maintain the same level of ownership under that system, but that doesn't mean
No,
they
because
they
they
lost First
become
Amendment
subject
rights.
to government regulation. I
Right,
mean,
but
for
not-
example, AT&T
Yeah.
would not be able to say, we're going to cut off all people who criticize Trump from using our telephone service. A private company would have that right, but AT&T wouldn't, because AT&T is treated as a utility.
AT&T didn't have that right since the 1930s under the Communication Act.
Exactly,
But that was a congressional thing in the 1930s.
Yeah, but the First Amendment supersedes a congressional act.
I agree, and the First Amendment wouldn't allow. They were basically bound into universal service and considered to be exempt from any liability for what people did using the phones.
Same with big tech.
Right, exactly. Almost the same, but that was a policy decision. No one was infringing their First Amendment rights as a company to express themselves.
No, but you were just saying that the First Amendment means that a company can block anybody they want from using their service if they have certain political
From
views.
expressing
but that's not
something-
what AT&T can do, because it's considered a monopoly. And if
but-
Facebook and Google are considered
What happens
monopolies,
over the
that would
phone-
happen. That would
what
be the same
happens
as them.
between two people on the phone is not the same as a First Amendment
I
concern.
mean, you can have a conference call with 50
Okay.
people, and you
We're
can plot a
get-
terrorist
we're getting-
attack.
We're getting way too into
No, I'm
hypotheticals.
just saying. No, I think it's actually
terms
crucial
of
at how do we treat Facebook and Google.
I
That's
agree.
crucial to the
That is a
discussion.
big question. That is the question. What is not, I think, something we should worry about is the work of people like Renee, who are studying the situation and making suggestions. I think we need to take seriously things that are causing harm in society, even expressions that are causing harm in society. Doesn't mean we should censor them, but we should address them. And we can urge these companies that have the power to make decisions that we think are in the public interest, and they can agree or disagree with us.
But your work is not about labeling things as disinformation so that then those views that are so labeled will be banned, right? That's my understanding of what your view is, having listened.
So I don't think labeling is censorship, and we might disagree on that.
No, I don't either. I'm saying
Okay.
labeling so that those views then become suppressed.
No,
or
I don't
banned.
think that suppression works. I've been pretty clear on that in everything I've written. I think that it turns it into forbidden knowledge, and I think that backfires. One of the things that I think is important about those moments when something is beginning to go viral is you should be telling, for example, state and local election officials in that moment, you need to be in this conversation. It's actually very important that you be speaking in this conversation too. I do think that platforms do have a right to decide under their policies what they're going to do in those circumstances. I think overwhelmingly the right answer is to label and to direct people to more information. And that's because I think that otherwise the backfire effect is so significant that unless there is something that is incitement or something that is overtly harmful, we did see moments in COVID where you would see the platforms take down something that said like, there were these various moments where like fake cures would come up and stuff like this. But ultimately the freedom of speech, freedom of reach distinction, how do you think about what to surface, what to curate? That's where I think the interesting part of the conversation is. And the reason I mentioned Blue Sky is not because I like it because it's lib Twitter. It's because it gives that power to users.
This sort of experiment we've seen with content moderation over the last decade, where they ramped it up and now they're ramping it down, has shown us that you can't do content moderation that makes everyone happy. You can't do content moderation that bats 1,000. You can't do content moderation at scale that works everywhere the same way around the world. It's a messy system, and we're never going to be happy with it. But the companies themselves have figured out they need something, or else they end up with a bunch of pornography and a bunch of violence and a bunch of distraction, and the average user finds the experience to be horrifying, and they stop using it, right? That's why it's in their best interest to do some content moderation. The terms of it, again, are determined inside the companies. That's where the power sits.
One of the arguments that I have made over the years is that we have to be arguing for transparency and that we don't have that. Right now, all of the transparency that they do is voluntary, and in the United States, it's voluntary. The European laws try to compel it. And one of the ways that we found out that X, when it became X, even after Elon took it over, was continuing to comply with takedown requests from India to censor Modi's political opponents, was through this thing that was called the Lumen database. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it was this database that was set up where when certain types of takedown requests would come in, a lot of times it was DMCA, which is
Copyright. stuff.
copyright. But you would also see these requests from governments, and Twitter, when it was Twitter, was regularly uploading these takedown requests to Lumen. And somebody noticed that X was continuing to comply with these takedown requests from India. And they chose to use it as a, haha, you're not a free speech absolutist because you're complying. Now, legally, in order to operate in that market, X has to comply.
Which was
And this
Elon's
is the same-
argument.
Which was Elon's argument. In response, Twitter has stopped uploading to Lumen. Since that controversy in April of a couple of years back, they just no longer upload. So we have less transparency. We don't know if it's happening. We don't know what they're doing, and we have no visibility. And that's because there's no law in the United States that compels them to disclose that information. And one of the reasons for that is because when we talk about the US Congress and what it wants to regulate, both the Democrats and the Republicans want to have these sort of punitive measures. You took down too much, you didn't take down enough.
Exactly.
We're going to hold you hostage for not moderating the way that we
Exactly.
want. Transparency is not a thing that people wake up and get riled up over. And so that means that the thing that would provide us with the best visibility into what these incredibly powerful platforms are actually doing is something that nobody is willing to go to the mat for. And so, again, they have a First Amendment right in this country to do what they want to do as they see fit. In markets outside of the US, they're going to adhere to those laws so that they can continue to operate. If we want to have that visibility, the best thing that we can be doing, the laws being what they are, is to lobby for those transparency laws. But that's not actually happening.
So I just want to make a suggestion. It feels like all three of you are on the same spectrum, but different parts of it when it comes to what exactly, I don't think anyone's arguing for the Wild West of the internet, right? Unless that's what you're...
For me, when it comes to political opinions,
No,
yes,
I'm
all
talking about
speech.
everything. I'm
No,
talking about
no,
everything.
No,
Do we have any moderation? Do we have no moderation?
no, clearly there's illegal things you can do with speech.
And so there seems to be some agreement that we need some kind of control over what is disseminated online, over what is and isn't factual. One question that I want to pose, do we just allow each of us as individuals to decide for ourselves what we engage with, what we don't engage with, what is true, what isn't true? Should it just be left up to us?
Well, in an ideal world, yes. Why I like protocol-based platforms so much is that makes that possible in a very material sense. You can create feeds in accordance with your values. Like, that's what gives you the power to do that. But on centralized social media platforms right now, you are at the mercy of the people who control them. And so what you can do, there's a framing that we use sometimes, exit versus voice, right? You can either leave and go somewhere else, like to a protocol-based platform, but that's a heavy lift for some people. Or you can choose to be vocal about what you want and to try to sway the platform to change its policies in the direction that you want it to go. But you have very little recourse on those platforms at this time. And so what I think that we should be asking for, recognizing that the First Amendment rights are theirs and not ours, is that call for transparency. It is that call to say at least we should understand what is happening here, even if we don't have direct control over it. I think that social media researchers, people like me, try to do, to the best of our ability, that question of both what is happening, how can we help the public understand it better, and then also, again, using my First Amendment rights, saying this is what I think could be done differently, and making those arguments in accordance with my values, whatever they may be, assuming that other people will do the same, whatever their political alignment or biases are. I'm very cognizant, by the way, and very uncomfortable with the extent to which they have a very profound power, and I would like to see a proliferation of platforms. I think it's very entertaining to go read the terms of service on some of these platforms. Rumble has a specific shout out prohibiting people from glorifying like Antifa. That is something that is uniquely Rumble, and I think it's great because I actually don't think that they should all have the same values, because I think that we should want to see this proliferation of places that people can go, and that they should understand that when they are in those places, those are the rules that apply. And that's really the best that we have at our disposal at this moment in time.
Glenn, I wonder what you think about what any possible solution is. We've talked about transparency, which I think you agree with a little bit, but ultimately, should people just be left to their own devices?
I think that for me, the best solution is to embrace as much as we can what I regard as the values of the Enlightenment. That for me was the most important political revolution and intellectual revolution in the West over the last 500 years, which is the idea that we don't want institutions of authority dictating to us the limits of what we can think and say, nor do we want centralized power determining for us what is truth and what is false, which means embracing as vibrant and a robust version of free speech as we can. And I think anybody who finds themselves justifying content moderation when it's directed at views they dislike politically, and then complaining when it's directed at views they like politically, should really question whether they're applying consistent principles or whether they're applying censorship. And I actually think that as long as there are centralized companies that just flip a switch on or off, they're always going to be vulnerable to government pressure or other kinds of pressure. We should be safeguarding free discourse, either from government control or from massive corporate control, as much as we can.
Siva, I want to give you the last word. This conversation is not new. It's as old as time. And so I want to ask you, what do we understand? What have we learned throughout history about the nature of information and who gets to control it?
Well, we've learned that people who are hungry for power will try their best to control it. We've learned that we need institutions that are transparent and trustworthy and have widespread public buy-in to limit the power of tyrannical leaders and tyrannical forces and tyrannical corporations. We fall way short on all of those things. And as a result, we don't trust institutions we should trust. Sometimes we do trust institutions we shouldn't trust. And we've lost, if we ever had, the ability to discriminate between what is worthy of trust and what is not. And I think one of the reasons we find it so hard to discriminate appropriately between institutions and experts we trust versus those we are cynical about is that across the globe, we have suffered trauma after trauma after trauma. People have really good reasons to not trust institutions and not trust experts. But we also have very good reasons to trust institutions and experts. And so it's our job, if we want to have a better life for everybody and thrive, be healthier, be more peaceful, be more just, to figure out ways that we can assign and maintain and deserve public trust in institutions that are actually serving us, right? And be willing and able to criticize them when they fall short and have them engage in self-correction, from good faith. When I look back over the last 30 years and I see all of these traumas around the world, I say, well, no wonder we're impatient. No wonder we're frustrated. But it really is that much more important for us to rebuild trust in these institutions so that we can actually address the next pandemic. We can limit the damage of climate change. We can manage the flow of human beings across borders, which is going to happen increasingly, and there's very little we can do to stem it. How do we manage that, right, without creating civil wars and massive oppression? To have that kind of a discussion, we need better ways of conversing. I don't think our platforms, whether centralized or decentralized, are designed for deliberation. They are designed for expression. They're designed for attention. They're designed for banter. And there's value in all that. There's good reason to be engaged in all of those, but they're not enough. We need other levels and other places where we can have rich, deep discussions. I'm actually gratified by the fact that the three of us were able to question each other, push back against each other, ask what, I'm deeply curious about the bodies of knowledge that the people around this table are bringing to it. That we need more styles like that. And that requires investment of time, of money, and of attention. And so I'm not optimistic that we're getting there anytime soon, but I think we do have to figure out better ways to talk about important issues, or we're going to be lost.
I couldn't have put it better myself. And what a note to end on. I want to thank the three of you for being here. This has been a spirited and very generous debate. So I appreciate all of you. Thank you guys so much.
That was fun.
Yeah, it was fantastic. I really loved it. I
Yeah.
thought it was super stimulating. I think these are exactly the kind of conversations, like you said, that we need a lot more of.
Yeah.